Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and in this video what I want to do is talk about using Sequalize with Express. So basically, oftentimes when you are talking about using different databases with any backend framework, usually you look for some sort of object manager. Okay, it's not the only way you can do it. You can also use query builders, or just use the raw drivers for the database. There's different ways to connect to the database. Okay, generally it's just one layer built on top of each other. So like the most straightforward layer is using the raw drivers, which you can just literally send SQL directly to the database. But it can be a lot of work to use them if you ever use them, because basically you get back these row structures and you have to go through each row and build out your data. Then there's things like Connects, which is a query builder, which doesn't work as an ORM. What it does allows you to build the SQL queries in a safe way, and does a lot of that work of going through those rows and generating them into data for you on the back end, but it doesn't quite give you the same level of abstraction as a ORM, an object relationship manager, where you actually literally create models, kind of like if you ever use Mongoose for Mongo databases. You create a model object and then you interact with your database through the model object. That's what ORMs do. Every language has lots and lots of ORMs that you can then mix and match with any backend framework. Okay, an ORM just allows you to work with the database in a much easier way. The backend framework allows you to write routes for your server, and you can mix and match to your heart's content. So one of the most popular ORMs for Node is Sequalize, for working with particularly SQL databases, which could be Postgres, could be MySQL, could be MariaDB, could be SQLite 3, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, whatever SQL database you like. Again, SQL is just a shared language between all these databases. Each of them do, under the hood, work differently. Okay, it's kind of like, I can use English to talk to 10 different people, and generally if I say the same English words, they mean the same things, but they are 10 different people. Okay, so allows me to use a variety of technologies, but use the same way to express the same things to those technologies. Okay, so with that, let's actually first just set up our Express project. Okay, there's a bajillion different ways you can set it up. That's the beauty of programming, that you can kind of just, as long as you know how the things work, there's infinite ways to set these things up. But I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. So I'm going to open up my terminal. Here I have an empty folder that I've opened up in here in VS Code. And I am going to just create a new node project. So npm init-y. Actually, first, even before I do that, let me just do a touch a server.js, a .gitignore, because we always want to make sure we gitignore some files, and a .env file, and anything else I want to touch in there. Let's just do a models, or let's call this a database.js. I'm going to avoid making any folders. I'm going to keep this really, really simple. Okay, so we'll just make it all in a database.js. Okay, so there's all my files. Okay, then what I'm going to do is create a node project, npm init-y, and then I'm going to install all the stuff that I need. So npm install, I'm going to need Express because that's going to be my backend server. I'm going to need .env because I want to use a .env file. I'm going to need I'm going to need Sequalize. So let me just make sure I spelled that right. I always got to double check that. Sequalize. I'll just copy that from there. Sequalize. Now, Sequalize is just the ORM, so it just gives you the simplified way to connect to the database, but it isn't the actual database drivers. Okay, it knows how to use them, so you need to also install the driver, and all a driver means is it's a piece of software that tells one thing how to talk to another thing. So the specific driver for the database you plan on using. Okay, I'm going to use SQLite 3 to keep things real simple. Okay, but again, if you're using Postgres, you would use Postgres drivers. If you're using MySQL, you would download this driver, so forth and so forth and so forth. So I'm going to use the SQLite 3 driver. That way, you don't have to worry about installing any database software or going to some other website to get a database URL. You can just basically work straight from here. So SQLite 3, I think it was. SQLite 3. Okay. So that should be the main things that I need. Okay, so I'm installing all that. Okay, cool. And basically what I'm gonna do is first go here my .getignore and make sure I ignore my node modules folder, because you never want to upload your node modules folder to GitHub, and you never want to upload your .env, okay? Because you want to protect your database credentials. You don't want people seeing your database URL in your GitHub, because if they can see it in there in your code, then they can grab that and use it and inject stuff into your database that you don't want in there, or delete your database, or really ramp up the usage of your database with a bunch of data you don't want. And if there's no sort of cap on what you're using, you can end up with a big bill. So generally, you do not want your database URLs in your code base, which is why it's always smart to use .env files. Now, standard pretty much around across all databases, all languages, is that generally you're going to put your database connection URL under a variable called database URL. It doesn't have to be called database URL. It's just a name. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it cheese. Okay, but we're going to say database URL. Now, so if this was your Postgres, this is where you would put your Postgres URL. If this was MySQL, you put your MySQL URL here. I'm going to be using SQLite 3. So generally, an SQLite 3 URL is going to look like this. So I'm just going to copy this here. Okay, actually, I don't want that specific one. Let me just look up here. SQLite URL. Okay, I always get confused with like exactly how that should look like. Yeah, here we go. Well, that's not. This is all in. That's like Windows formatting. Just Sequalize. Here we go. That's what I want. Okay. The reason why I didn't want to do like that one they show you there where it says like memory, if you look in the Sequalize documentation, this means it creates no database. Like it literally just works in memory. And then when you shut down your server, everything gets erased, which works fine for now, but I want to be able to shut down the server and turn it back on and actually have the data saved somewhere. So what you do here is that if I can pass this, okay, then I can just tell this what the file name is. And we'll just call this like, database the .db. So what it'll do, it's going to create a file called database.db, and that's where it's going to store all the data. Because SQLite, it's an in-memory database, which means the database just kind of hangs out in your memory while you're running your software. But generally what you can do is you can have it update a file, so that way when you reopen it, it'll just read that file and then reload the database back into memory. Very great for development and very small local purposes. Not necessarily the database you want to use for production. When you have a lot of concurrent users, then you want like a Postgres, MySQL, Oracle, Microsoft. Great for again local development and other use cases. Yeah. So let me just actually make sure that we'll check that real quick. Yep, that looks all good to me. Let me see if there's anything else people say about that. Okay, that's all fine to me. Okay, cool. Okay, so now what we're going to do is I'm going to head over to this database.js and start writing the code to actually like establish a database connection in Sequalize. All that matters is you create a new Sequalize object. And that Sequalize object is given the credentials to connect to the database it's going to connect to. That's literally all that matters. Okay, everything else you see in tutorials is just overcomplicating it. Okay, so again, I can bring in the Sequalize constructor, the thing that creates the Sequalize object, with the syntax right here. Okay, cool. Now again, I could use this syntax if I want. Okay, again, let's say I want to use actually I won't even bother with the ES module syntax for now. Keep it simple. Okay. Okay, so there I bring in the constructor, and then I'm going to say, hey, I want to establish my database connection. And all I have to do, and then again, I want to make sure I also bring in my .env variable, so require .env .config. Okay, that's going to load my .env variables, because that's what that does. It's going to read this file and then load those into my environment. So now I can just do this. Okay, what I'll do is I'll grab that variable out of database. So create database URL, create a variable. Again, the variable's name doesn't matter. The idea is I'm going to say, hey, this is going to equal the database URL for my .env. Why am I doing this? Just so that way I don't have to keep writing process.env every single time. Now I just have a URL called database URL. It just looks a lot cleaner. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to say const connection. Again, doesn't matter what the variable's name is. const connection equals new Sequalize object. So I'm creating a new Sequalize object. And essentially, you see here, this just takes like this options object. Okay. Now, one way you could do this is, as you see here, I can just pass it a string with the database connection string. That's totally going to work. Or I can pass it an object that has all the details of the database connection. Okay, so those are essentially my choices. Or you can pass it a bunch of strings with the different pieces of your connection information in this order. Either way works. Okay, I like using connection strings. I find that a lot simpler, a lot easier. Okay, because I'm just thinking about one thing. I have one string that has the password, the username, the database, all of it in one thing. Okay, much easier for me to think through. Okay, so I just go here and just pass it database URL. That's it. Okay, that's going to establish a connection because it's going to use whatever database URL I have in .env, and then when I deploy it to a service like Render or Heroku, I just make sure that on that platform this variable is defined. Okay, because again, you're not going to upload your .env to GitHub, so you have to define those environmental variables on those deployment platforms. Okay, cool. Okay, and let's create like a quick model. So let's go to model basics and just see how you create a model. Okay, so as you see here, creating a model just requires us to have two things: our Sequalize object. Okay, and if we see here, all they're doing is, notice like they don't even need to create, they're just using the connection they already created. Okay, so, and then here we have this data types object because you need to describe what type of data is in the model. So essentially what that would look like is that now that I've created my connection object, okay, which is the same thing as this lowercase Sequalize variable in the documentation. Okay, so essentially what I called connection is the same thing as this lowercase Sequalize, because see, that's what they're doing in this line. They're creating that Sequalize object, their connection here, and then they're using that object to define any models that are available. Okay, and that's that. And actually, even before we go there, we want to make sure that you always want console log to show that your connection is working. So I'm going to go back a step for a second because there's this code right here. You're going to want this. So I'm just going to literally just take that from the documentation. I'm going to put that right below here. I'm just going to say here like prove connection established. Okay, and basically what this does is that this just double checks to see, hey, is the connection working? Okay. Although this syntax may not work here. The reason being is that needs, because I'm using a what's called common JS syntax, which is when I use the requires. There is no top level await. Okay, if you want top level await, meaning you don't have to use the await keyword in an async function, you would need to switch over to ES module syntax. So what's the fix? I just wrap this in a function. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to wrap this in a function test connection, and then make this an async function, so that way I can use the async keyword. I mean the await keyword, and just copy this try block here. Save. And then I'm just going to immediately call that function, test connection. Okay, and basically, if the connection is successful, I'm going to get this console log. Connection has been established successfully, and if the connection's not working, it's going to tell me this. Okay, so this way I have some data in my console log, that gives me an idea that things are working. At this point, I can't test this out. I can just run that file. So I can just go node database.js, because all the code I need is in that file, so there's no, I can run this. Okay, and I get an error. Okay, so let's see what it says. Unable to connect, reference error Sequalize is not defined. Oh, because again, this is not called Sequalize, I called it connection here. So I have to use that variable, connection. Okay, there we go. Connection, now let's try that again. Okay, and see, it worked. Okay, my connection, so basic, that's it. That's all it took to make a connection. It was just literally this one line and passing it the right URL. That's it. Okay, and then this code right here is just to test to see if that connection was successful. Okay, and then I'm just running that function. And you can see, it created that database.db file. So it created that SQLite3 database. Okay, wonderful. There's no data in it, but that doesn't matter right now. Okay, so that works. Now what I want to do is create two models from those connections. So now I can go to model basics. I could create the model. I could export my connection now and then bring it into other files if I want to, make models in separate files. So if I wanted to do that, I could do something like, if I wanted to create like a models folder, I can create like a models folder. And then I can create, let's say we'll create a to-do model, new file, to-do.js. Okay, and then all I would do is import that connection. So import connect, well, I have to export it first. So let's go over here. Okay, module.exports equals connection. Okay, so that's exported. And that's all this file does. It just creates a connection and exports it. That's it. Okay. So I want to import, not import connection, it would be const connection equals require dot dot slash database.js. Okay. And there we go. Now so I have the connection here as it is anywhere else. And now I can start creating the model. Okay, and if I go to the model basics, you see we just used, again, I called it connection, but it's the same thing as this like lowercase Sequalize. Okay, I just prefer calling it connection because that's really what it is. It's my database connection. But we're going to use this define function to define a model. Okay, so then I just basically, I'll just literally just copy this from the documentation, just as to serve as a, okay, and then it does make sense that I actually want to import the data types thing as well from Sequalize, so I'll do that. Const data types. Let's see here. Actually, I won't just do this. Const. What is it? Data types. Const data types equals require Sequalize. Now notice I'm not importing the Sequalize constructor again because I technically already constructed my Sequalize object in that other file. I already have that. That part's done. Okay, the documentation is showing you the whole thing because they're not assuming that you're doing these things in multiple files. So that's why you're seeing like, hey, we're establishing the connection and then we're creating the model. That's essentially what's happening there. Okay. So there, I got the things I need. Again, I can copy that example model. Now again, I want to make this a to-do model, so I'll just change this to to-do. I'm going to change the model name to to-do. Okay, and my model is going to have two properties. It's just going to have, title of the to-do, which will be a string, so that's good as it is. Allow null, that's fine. So that just means it can't be blank. And then it'll have a description. Okay, which will also be a string, and that's fine. Okay, and then other model options would go here, but I don't have any, so I'm just gonna clean that up. Just clean up all these comments out of there. Okay, and then you see there's my model, and now I can just module that exports a model equals to do. Okay, now again, the thing about SQL databases is that they're not necessarily migrated. The nice thing about Sequalize is that I don't have to run migrations. You can, but you don't have to. What you can do is you can use the sync function in Sequalize. And what it'll do is it'll essentially do the same thing as migration. So let me just actually find where they talk about that. Because what you have to do is you just run this one function and it'll always just make sure that the database table matches to the database connection. So let's just find that. What I can do is I can always just use F and type sync. Here we go, model synchronization. Of course, it would just be like 2 seconds later in the documentation. Okay, and so you can see there's different versions here. So this creates a table if it doesn't exist. This creates a table dropping it first if it already exists. This checks what is the current state of the table in the database and then performs the necessary changes in the table. Okay, so you can see here that it's going to do like a sync. Now again, that's awaited. So that means I need to make sure I do that in an async function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function, an async function. And we'll just call this like migrate to do. And all this is going to do is literally just take to do and then dot sync. Okay, and then the option is alter true. So that way it creates it if it's not created and then updates it if it's updated. Okay, done. And then I'm just going to call that function. And actually I have to make sure I await that. Okay. Cool. Because if I don't know, I've had this problem before where I forgot to like handle the asynchronous nature of that function, and it caused some like weird issues where like it just wasn't like working. Okay, so again, basically what I did here is I imported my connection that I established in my other file. Okay, I grabbed my data types because I had to define the different type of each property in the model. I create my model. I'll just say, hey, okay, here's my model. It's called this, and these are the properties. And then I'm gonna basically, instead of having to create migrations, I can use the sync function. I'm gonna wrap that sync function in an async function, so that way I can await it. So that way, basically the database connection will be awaited, and this will be awaited, and all these promises should resolve properly. Okay, and then I call that function, and then we export that to do. Okay, so wonderful. So now let's head over to our server.js, and we'll create some routes where we can create a to-do and list all our to-dos and that kind of thing. Okay, so here we go. Let's import, keep thinking ES module syntax. Const express equals require express. Const, all I really need is my models. I don't need to import the connection because technically my models already import the connection. So again, the whole chain of how everything runs. So I can just be like const to do equals require dot slash model slash to do. Okay, other things I want to import here. Actually, I still want to make sure I get my .env files just in case. Require. I don't think I'm going to be using any .env variables here, but just in case, just call that before anything else. Const to do, const express. Anything else I installed that I need right now? I think we're good. Okay, so let's create our application object. Create express app. So const app, const app equals express. Okay, let's register our middleware. Okay, I mean, typically the kind of middleware that I would set up is, I'm going to make sure that I would have Morgan. So I would, technically here I'd have like logging middleware. I didn't install Morgan, so, but here's where I would put like logging middleware. I am going to want to parse JSON coming in, so I would be like app.use, app.use express.json. Okay, so that way it parses any JSON bodies coming in. I would want any other kind of middleware, session middleware, token cookie parsing middleware, whatever other middleware that I plan on using would be there. I don't think I need any for this particular purpose. So now we're going to create a route to show all to-dos, and then we're going to create a route to add one to-do. We're going to keep it real simple. Okay. So app.get. I'm not going to be following sort of RESTful convention where basically, we use like a JSON body to create the to-do. I'm going to do everything with params, again, because I'm just trying to give this the simplest demonstration possible. Okay, so this is going to be our main route. Well, actually, we'll just call it like all to-dos. Again, not a RESTful name of a route, but not the point. Okay, I'm going to make it an async function. That way I can use a sync await. Okay, rec res. Okay, and first thing I want to do is get all the to-dos. So let me go look inside the documentation and figure out, hey, what is the function to get all the to-dos? That's going to be the model querying part of the documentation. So I'm going to go over there and I'm going to take a look, okay, how do I get all? So here's how I create a user. We'll be using that in a second. Now let me see here, we see a select. So I want to find all. So that sounds like exactly like what I want. Okay, so that would be like const to-dos equals to-do dot find all. And again, I want to await that. Okay, now let's see why it's not happy with that. Async rec res all to-dos. Somewhere I'm not seeing something. App.get. That's the parentheses. The first argument is this. There's a comma. That's usually where we make a mistake if forget a comma, but not saying that. And then that's a parentheses, rec res, and there's a comma between those. There's the arrow. Where is it expecting? Yeah, let's do this. Okay, and let's just start with a fresh function. Okay, it likes that. Let's make that function async. So far, it likes that. Let's add our parameters. It likes that. So far, so good. Okay, so far, so good. Okay, there's just something that I could not see in the previous. So const to do or to do's equals await to do dot find all. Okay, so that's going to give me all my to-dos. That's the function that's going to get all to-dos. How do I know that? Because I've read the documentation, so I know it's like the model name dot find all. Okay, cool. And then what I can do is I can then do like a res.json and then just pass that to-dos object to the response. Okay, so that's going to give me all the to-dos, which should be none right now. And then we're going to say route to create a to-do. And I'm going to just use params for this, just make it real simple. Make to do. It's going to be an async function, rec, res. Okay. Cool. And then actually the URL is going to have two params. So we're going to have two params for the title and a param for the description. So literally I'm going to pass everything via the URL. Okay, and then I want to just grab that title and description from the params equals rec.params, because that's where they would be. And then we're going to create. So let me go back to that create function. So here we go, user.create, and we just pass it an object with the right properties that match our model. Okay, pretty simple enough. So const to do equals to do await to do.create, await to do.create, and we're just going to pass it an object with the title and description. Okay, that we just pulled that in the previous line, and then we will res.json that new to do. Okay, and that's it. Those are my two routes. Now we just turn on the server. So app.listen. Okay, ideally I want to use process.env.port, so I'll do that. So what I'm going to do is right here before that, I'm going to just create a variable port equals process.env.port. And if process.env.port isn't defined, I will use port 4000. Okay. So I'll say, okay, use port, and then we pass a callback for after the server starts. That's just going to console.log using backticks for interpolation. Console.logs port you can server running on port $sign here port. Okay, cool. And that should be all good to go. That's it. Okay, I've created two routes. Nice and simple. So let me go back to my terminal here. And I'll just run the server.js now. Node server.js. Okay, we got some errors, so let's work those out. So Sequalize is not defined. Okay, so that's going to be which file? To-do.js. Again, that's because I keep forgetting that I changed this to connection. So I got to make sure that's got to match whatever I called it. Because again, I called it connection. I didn't follow the docs, which called it lowercase equalize. Again, you can call things whatever you want, but you got to remember to translate things when they need to be translated. So that should be good now. So we will run that. Okay, and it's running. Okay, all this looks like all this I think I'm pretty sure I can just ignore that. Doesn't look. I don't see anything in there that looks. Yep, this is just it migrating the table. So you see here like it created the table to-dos. So it's just printing. It's just logging the SQL it's running when it does certain things. So when it ran that sync command, it created the table in that database. Wonderful. Okay, so now what I can do is let's go to localhost 4000. Right now there is no route for the main route. Now the other two are my routes are all to-dos. So let's go to all to-dos. I should get an empty array. All to-dos. And I get an empty array. Good. That's a good sign that it's working. And then the other route is called make to-do. Okay, so it's make to-do with two params for the title and description. So we'll say make to-do slash eat percentage, again, a percentage 20 equals a space. in URLs. It's called URL encoding. Percentage eat breakfast slash eat percentage 20 breakfast. That doesn't matter what they are. Okay, so again, this is going to be the title. This is going to be the description. Okay, so I hit enter on that, and it was successful. So I can see here that that was created successfully. Awesome. Okay, and let me do another one. We'll just call this like lunch. And this is lunch. Nice. Okay, good. Okay, now let's try my get to-dos route, or all to-dos route. Okay, and then there we go. I'm getting all the things. So it's simple as that. It's literally essentially and this is the same logic for any ORM in any language, working with any backend language. Using that database is just a matter of one, establishing the connection. Okay, that's what I did here. I established a connection, and then again, you always kind of want some sort of mechanism to test that connection is live. Because if I don't have, like if I don't have this line here, I don't know my connection was successful. Okay, so that's just for my visual signaling. And then you want to create any models, okay, because your model objects are how you interact with the database. So I created my model, and then I just import that model, and I can just use them in my routes. Okay, and then here you see I'm just using my models in my routes to do the things I need to do. And the particular methods for that particular ORM, Object Relationship Manager, you just find in the documents. Okay, so you can see here, it's all going to be all the way over, kind of over here, the Sequalize documentation. Okay, again, you can get more complicated with how you set this up if you want, to test for different environments or use different environmental variables. But this is going to be by far sort of like the simplest setup. Like honestly, like if you had like a different environment, like a different database for development, which is generally what you would use locally, and a different database what you use in production when you deploy, I would just have the database URL variable, and it just has a different definition in your local.env versus the definition in your deployed environment. That's going to keep it nice and simple. Yeah, that way you don't have to worry about different if statements and config files and all that stuff. Keep it simple. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. My name is Alex Merced. This is how to use Sequalize with Express. Have a great day and enjoy, and I'll see you all next time. And again, make sure to hit subscribe, like the video, and subscribe to my podcast, Web Dev 101, if you haven't already. And if you also want to learn more about data and more like database-y type stuff, check out Datanation, my other podcast, and I'll see you all later.